now time to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Sikendar Shah. And Dr. Shah studied economics and did a doctorate at University of Michigan, before moving on to do a doctor of philosophy at Indiana University, Bloomington, and is a founder member of the law school now at the Lahore University of Management Science, as well as having served as legal advisor to the Foreign Ministry of Pakistan and the director of the Center for Chinese Legal Studies, also at Lahore. We are now back to speaking in person. Dr. Shah,
Thank you. Can I speak from over here, or do I need to?
Yeah, okay.
Can you understand better to
speak online.
It will be easy for everyone.
Attendees.
Just keep it mute and then
I put it on.
it will be perfect. Yeah, just stand here naturally. We'll catch it for a few. Okay. Then sure or anything. Deliver naturally.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me to this conference. I am taking a very critical position on climate justice and just transitions, as others have taken, coming from the global south. I also am an academic, so my assessments are quite academic. So I question certain ideas and concepts while I'm here. Even I'm thinking about things as we move forward. And I take a sort of a communal approach to these concepts, because I personally feel, and I've worked on federalism as well, that a lot of the solutions, at least how Pakistan is dealing with certain crises, the answers lie in sort of communal empowerment. Listening to Justice Mansoor and Justice Jawad today also, I feel that the role that the judiciary is performing in Pakistan, even though their way of looking at this particular crisis is judicial and legal, the effects are also political. For example, when Justice Mansoor talks about climate democracy, it's democratization of climate in Pakistan, and how the judgment really, and this is not in my presentation, I'm just talking about this based on what I heard today, is by doing that, he basically makes it into a democratic issue. Likewise, when Justice Jawad Hassan in his judgment talks about the ideas of climate justice and how, about forests, protection of forests, it's also an issue of federalism, of taking that agenda and how to interpret certain federal policies in a provincial context. So for me, bringing it down is always better than trying to have a national way of looking at these things. I also have a PowerPoint presentation, but I prefer to share it with you after I present, because that way, you'll be focusing more on what I'm saying and what the presentation lists. But I mean, again, as I said, that the presentation is a bit critical of both nation states, international organizations, and as well as sort of the global order, the global north. Again, this is an academic critique, so please keep that in mind. So let me just start here. I mean, it's clear that climate justice and just transition are concepts whose boundaries are contested, right? These are contestations around space, scale, and time. And much of the conceptual ambiguity lies in the interaction of these ideas. As we probe the challenges of climate transformations, the names and the concepts that we use to frame our understandings of these have profound implications in the ways that we are able to imagine a response to these transformations. So let me just try to contextualize this. For example, what is climate justice and what is and just transition, right? I mean, let's question this. Who are the stakeholders? Whom is it for? Who delivers the justice? Is it the global north? Is it the global south? Are these states? Are these federating units? Are these communities? And to whom? Again, the same actors or different actors. These are all profoundly political questions. In Pakistan's context, the understanding of climate concerns and its consequences are increasingly on the popular agenda. This is with a strong orientation towards contextualizing climate concerns around vulnerability and express articulation of Pakistan's minimal contribution to the climate transformation experienced in Pakistan. So again, this is what Justice Mansoor was also taking. Discussing. It's a nationalistic approach that we're not causing this. So our challenges are different. So our responsibilities. But at the same time, at another scale, communities articulate climate concerns from the lived experiences and their increasing inability to respond to the impact of climate change, such as high temperatures and repetitive cycles of flooding. For these communities, it is often the state policy actually that makes them precarious, and questions of justice are oriented towards that adaptability and mitigation. Climate action and articulation of this sort are often marginalized by the broader framework. So again, a lot of the criticism coming in Pakistan that is invisible is criticism of the state itself rather than the global community or the global transformations that are happening. Similarly, just transition remains a contested term, rooted in labor and industrial transitions, such as from coal to oil, that are meant to be fair or not unfair to those employed in the industry that is being divested from. In Pakistan's context, it remains largely unarticulated, with application limited to understandings framed by the IMF and the World Bank in the numerous studies on renewable energy, with community benefit and benefits sharing largely restricted to concerns about the provision of educational and medical facilities and unemployment, usually the activities adjacent or sometimes totally unrelated to the energy transition itself. So, hence, in Pakistan, the conceptual framework for both CJ and JT, I'm using them as acronyms now, are often prescribed by multilateral bodies, the IMF, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank, which under traditional formulations of international law have no actual climate obligations. These operate at different scales, okay? So at the macro scale, how IFIs and MDBs, again, International Financial Organization, multilateral development banks, I'll use acronyms from here on, interact with countries. How do they interact with countries? How global financial markets flows and ratings can be predatory in nature. So domestic economy being dependent on foreign investments from countries such as China with their own geopolitical interests. So we see this in Pakistan in terms of the resistance of some of these financial organizations, institutions, to lowering of subsidies that benefit, energy subsidies that benefit the lower classes, preference for hydropower over solar energy because of their involvement from the 60s on promoting hydro energy, and then subsequently the privatization of energy through IPPs, which I will also discuss. So that at times, the resistance is coming from these institutions to climate justice. So at a micro level, you have local level problems, lack of community stewardships on projects, coercive land acquisition practices, lack of community feedback or consideration on projects, insufficient resettlement provisions, the very idea who is an affectee and a stakeholder needs to be broadened. So looking at the informal employment sector and migrants and refugee workers are ignored. A glimpse in their operations give us an indication of what these prescriptions entail. So let me discuss some of those. So IMF, for instance, there were duties instituted on solar panels, under pressure, and then they were subsequently removed. And the reason being that because there were payments to be made to IPPs and people had started moving to a more devolved way of producing solar energy by themselves through using solar panels. So had increase of duties on, and there was a lot of resistance from that, and that was subsequently removed. World Bank's involvement in the energy sector and its guidance on solarization possibilities, which I will discuss in a little bit about how if solar energy is to be promoted in Pakistan, it had to be done as a particular project with more centralized solar parks and more federal ways of distributing energy. And as I said earlier, the focus on hydropower World Bank's involvement in hydropower gives us an insight into the nature of prescriptions and its implication on questions of CJ and JT. So how renewable energy is defined in Pakistan with under, the World Bank had a big role to play in that because of the projects they were involved in. Hydropower is included as a form of renewable energy, and in the context of Pakistan, that has proven to be incorrect because it has a lot of environmental costs and long-term repercussions, which I will discuss subsequently. Okay, moving forward, I'm going to some kind of specifics here. It is clear that the IFIs have had a foundational role in Pakistan's hydropower landscape. However, it is also the conceptual framework that allows us to think the problems through that permeates how we can conceive the problems of climate justice. As such, its operations, languages, and knowledge creation dictates the terms by which we can understand and articulate concerns of climate justice and just transitions in the widest possible sense. So, for example, there are geographical and temporal considerations, existing ways of thinking, and indeed existing accountability mechanisms often fail to consider the geographical and temporal dimensions of environmental or climate-related disasters. So, for example, long-term impact of these projects are not accounted for in these equations. In the case of Pakistan, a lot of hydropower projects didn't account for local realities, such as cultural ways of dealing with environmental climate disasters like floods, which were displaced when you brought in a particular conventional dam-based model, which I will discuss in a bit. Also, through the dams themselves, because of the geographical, particularities of the region, accumulated a lot of sedimentation, which basically may make these dams eventually, redundant, and that sedimentation, that deprivation of sediment in downstream has resulted in a lot of displacement and a lot of land erosion. So continuing, while conceptualizations exist of project effectees or project impact persons, the existing frame of thinking fails to consider effectees of policy regimes that are not contained by location and are much more far-reaching. Similarly, existing accountability mechanisms such as MDB inspection panels are currently operating under an unrealistically narrow time frame. For instance, the EBRD's project complaint mechanism only accepts application on projects within 12 months of the last loan disbursement. The ADB has a cutoff date of 2 years after the grant of loan closing date. This simply does not work for environmental harms or climate justice because the impact of ecological interventions extend for decades into the future and are often continuous as well as cascading. By extension, it is also too difficult to isolate environmental harm by the project or policy that causes them, as there is abundant cross-cutting in a given ecosystem. Therefore, a just transition becomes contingent on a systematic change that goes to the heart of the developmental policy process. The climate crisis is a result of past harms, and unless accountability is served, we are at risk of the same decisions being taken going into the future. It would be deeply endangering to attribute our current ecological crises to greenhouse gas emissions alone, ignoring other topographical effects such as interferences in river hydrology from extensive canal building and sedimentation and flooding issues from large hydropower dams, which is something I just discussed. A just transition, in order to be truly just, must address victims and effectees of legacy projects and provide proper remedy, as opposed to being focused merely on adaptation. It must seek to challenge power holders for the decisions they make and create space for indigenous knowledge. So, moving forward, transitions on the global scale have mostly been defined so far within the realm of energy and power. Shifting, for example, electricity production from fossils to renewables. This only tackles the fuel source instead of tackling inequalities embedded within production processes and value chains, most of which reproduce colonial patterns of production. This is most evident in utility scale renewable energy, which relies on generating a large quantum of solar and wind power in one location. Usually land acquired in farming or communal areas and transmitting it across long distances to urban demand centers located elsewhere. This is exactly what's happening in Pakistan. The resistance to it is there by the federal government. This perpetuates a system of violence and exploitation of taking away land from the already disenfranchised, requiring them to relocate, taking away their assets and livelihoods for the benefit of other consumers who must give up nothing in the process. Redesigning energy generation to occur in distributed forms is of the essence, one that does not involve land grabbing or taking away vast swaths of freshwater bodies such as lakes. A similar case can be made from the ethical manufacturing of RE technologies and batteries. Mineral mining cannot be extractivist in nature or harmful to local communities or the environment. Labor conditions across the value chain must be accounted for. So, for example, reports indicate that some Xinjiang silicon, which is used in solar cell plants, have employed forced labor of Uyghurs. Silver mining based mainly in Mexico, China, Peru, Chile, Australia, Russia, and Poland can sometimes cause heavy metal contamination and community displacement. Okay, so moving forward, going back to the some of the sort of the expectations, coming to Pakistan, should Pakistan prioritize its own energy needs over international calls for a just transition? Some of the questions that evaluating the nationalist agenda that I was earlier referring to. At the national scale, climate justice is primarily linked to economic factors, reflecting the need for energy self-sufficiency. How does this focus impact local communities? What are the consequences for health, for community health and livelihoods? At the local scale, climate justice is primarily linked to the direct consequence of energy choices on community well-being. Increased coal extraction significantly affects local communities, leading to environmental degradation and social challenges. How can we articulate the interplay between national energy policy and local justice issues? Where does climate justice fit into the broader context of national and local interests? In terms of indigenous knowledge, community stewardship, and democratic dispersed decision-making that I initially referred to in the beginning, some observations. Capitalist modes of production have long relied on extractive practices, completely ignoring indigenous knowledge of land and water systems. This has led to ecological degradation of extreme proportion, including across agricultural land, in freshwater bodies, in mining areas, etc. I consider most contemporary land acquisition practices to be equal to theft, reliant as it is on involuntary displacement of households and communities. Instead, newer energy generation projects must consider local communities as equal benefits seekers and equity holders. I'm about to conclude. So from theory to practice, what does empowering communities look like? It looks like communities have control. I'll be done in 2 minutes. It looks like communities have control over their energy systems, water management, and land use, reversing decades of exploitation and environmental degradation caused by colonialism and continued through foreign funding projects, policies, and frameworks. Instead of imposing top-down, one-size-fits-all solutions like massive hydropower projects, the focus must shift to community-led adaptation projects. The international financial architecture needs transformation, beginning with significant debt relief in the global north. If the global north acknowledges its role in causing climate crises, it must also recognize the debt trap it has created in countries like Pakistan. And finally, mechanisms aimed at providing support, such as the loss and damage fund, are poorly resourced, and in this particular case, housed in one of the very institutions capable at making Pakistan more precarious to the impact of climate change. So that has to change. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.